Welcome to Voices of Deconversion. We share the inspirational stories of deconversion told by former Christians who are now atheist or agnostic. Our stories remind us we're in it together. They encourage us as we discover who we are and help us to embrace who we become.
Hey everybody, it's Steve. This week's episode is going to be a little bit different. I don't have a guest for you this week, but so my apologies if you were looking forward to another interview. We will start that up again next week. I have a couple guests coming up that I think you're going to really enjoy, and I do want to just mention them a little bit later in the podcast. But I really hope you will stick around because there's just a few things I want to talk about. There's some things that I've been wanting to talk about on the podcast for a little while, and I just thought I'd take this opportunity to do that. So I'll just lay it out for you really quick. There's going to be 4 things that I want to talk about. The first is the diversity in the guests that I choose. The second is getting your feedback. I have a few things that have kind of been swirling around in my head that I want to hear from you on. Third, I want to talk about how to connect via social media. Some of you probably already know some of this, but I want to talk about that and then a few other things. And then finally, fourth, I just want to talk about what's coming up on the podcast. There's a few guests that I want to tell you about. And then I have some ideas about Google Hangout that I want to mention. So I'd love it if you would just stick around. So let's go ahead and get into it. So the first thing that I wanted to talk about was, ever since I started the podcast, something that was really important to me was to have a diverse group of guests on the podcast. So not to interview the same type of person from the same type of background, from the same corner of the world. So it's something that's important to me. I think it makes the podcast more interesting. I think on a personal level, something that really, really drove me crazy when I had deconverted was feeling like nobody would listen to my story. Like all the Christians around me, they didn't care about what I had gone through. So the idea that there's someone out there whose story isn't being heard or isn't being told because people are just not thinking about it or ignoring them or whatever, that really bothers me. It reminds me of how I felt when I had deconverted. And finally, I really enjoy connecting with a variety of people and getting to know people from different backgrounds. You know, some have been Catholic, some from the LGBT community, feminists, Black non-believers, met a few folks from Puerto Rico. So there's been a nice variety of people that I've enjoyed talking to on the show. However, it's not been as easy as you might think to be able to connect and get someone to come on the podcast. And one of the things that I've found is, for instance, with female guests, I've had some awesome female guests on the podcast, and I've really appreciated every one of them. And I have several female guests that have reached out to me or that I have connected with that have agreed to come on the podcast in the future. And so that's great. If I reach out to, 15 women and ask them to be on the podcast in a given week, I probably get 4 of them to agree and say, sure, I'll come on the podcast. And then maybe 1 actually does. And so it's a lot of work to reach out and throughout the week be tweeting and emailing and reaching out to people, most of whom I don't know, perfect strangers or whatever. But and it's fun. Actually, I enjoy that part of it. It's fun to reach out and make new connections. But it's hard to get people to agree to come on, and there could be a variety of reasons. So one thing I know is for women who may have gone through something traumatic in a religious experience or came from a patriarchal or misogynistic version of Christianity, it can be hard to talk one-on-one to a guy who's a perfect stranger. So I totally understand that. And the other thing is, like, not everybody wants to talk to me. Not everybody wants to tell their story, and that's totally understandable, and that's fine. But there's a lot of people that I think would. And so I guess I'm asking for your help. So as far as maintaining a diverse group of guests, I would love to hear from you. So if you guys have ideas of people to reach out to, or like I said, know somebody, or you are someone with a unique background or story, I would love to hear from you. The other piece is, the whole reason I'm doing this is to encourage people who are deconverting. And there's not just one type of person who deconverts, obviously. So we don't need to hear just one type of deconversion story. Some are traumatic, some aren't. Someone who deconverts from a suburb of Seattle like myself versus someone who grew up in Alabama or Tennessee. It's a different kind of experience sometimes. And there's people all over the world that need to hear these stories and be encouraged by them. And I would just say that even if you feel that your story is not unique, because I've heard that from many people, that they just felt like their story wasn't that there was nothing remarkable about it, you'd be surprised. And you'd be surprised by what people find encouraging and what people relate to. And I would just encourage you, if you are someone that's thinking about telling your story, to reach out. So as far as that goes, there's some things that I thought of as far, some people can come on. Some people go onto podcasts and they're anonymous. They use a fake name or something. I thought about having Chrissy join me for some of these interviews. So just so it's not one-on-one for people who maybe are more comfortable in a setting like that. But I want to keep the diversity. I want to keep the list of diverse guests going. So just know that I'm doing my best, and I will continue to reach out to a variety of groups all over the world and do the best I can. But I could use your help, so that's one thing. That's one thing I wanted to mention. The second thing I wanted to get to is getting your feedback on a few things. So the podcast, a little while back, I split it up into part 1 and part 2. And, obviously 1 week we'll do the first half of someone's story, and then you have to wait a week for the second half. And the only reason I did that was, for me, having a full-time job, and we all get busy in life, I found it difficult to edit an entire hour-and-a-half podcast every single week, in addition to reaching out to people and doing an interview and all of that. So I just found it was easier. So that's really why I did it. I personally don't necessarily like to break up the stories. I think it's nice to keep them together. But the other piece is, for some people, it's a lot to listen to. An hour and a half of kind of a sometimes difficult, emotional story can be a little much or not easy to get through. So I want to know what you think about that. What I'm thinking of doing is either just keeping it the way it is, or doing a bi-weekly episode. So I would end up doing the same amount of editing. It wouldn't be any different for me, but I'd be keeping the podcast stories together. So one episode would air 1 week, and then 2 weeks later would be a new episode in its entirety. So the full hour and a half. Sometimes they're an hour long or whatever. But I wanted to know what you thought. I'm basically reaching out and trying to ask you what you think and what your feelings are, what your opinions are on that. It makes it more meaningful to me if I know that it's more meaningful to you. So a couple other just real quick things. If there's other types of things that you would find interesting, for instance, a topic-based podcast every once in a while. So an episode, every once in a while that deals with a topic that maybe I discuss with a guest, rather than these interviews every week. Let me know if that's something that you would find interesting. I love doing these interviews and hearing these stories, so that will continue. But mixing it up every once in a while is something I'm open to. And if that's something you guys would find valuable, let me know, because I think that might be something to try out. So as far as all of this feedback stuff goes, shoot me an email, steve@vodpodcast.com. Let me know if there's something you like, don't like, or something you want to see in the podcast. I'd love to hear from you. Okay, so the third thing that I wanted to talk about is I wanted to mention how to connect via social media. So a lot of you know that I'm on Twitter @VOD Podcast. I'm pretty active on Twitter. I'm not as active on Facebook, but I definitely check Facebook most days. Just look up Voices of Deconversion and you'll find it on Facebook. But for Twitter @VOD Podcast, that's pretty much my presence on social media. So it'd be great to connect via Twitter or whatever. And then something that, before I move on to the final thing and what's coming up in the podcast, I just wanted to say, I think it's so cool that we have listeners all over the country and actually all over the world. And I know that that's not remarkable or unique as far as podcasting goes, or with the internet and everything. But I find it pretty cool, and I really appreciate all of you listening, and no matter where you're listening from. So because I kind of think it's interesting, it may bore half of you to death, but I thought it'd be kind of fun to just mention a few of the places that have been listening to the podcast, and just let you know that I appreciate you and think it's cool, I guess. So this is probably really nerdy to do this, but I'm going to do it anyway. So, so first of all, we obviously get most of our listens through the United States. And in the United States, California has the most downloads. I'm sure some of this has to do with population, but yeah, there's most of the downloads come out of California, twice as many as come out of my home state, Washington State. And then Texas and North Carolina are the next two that we get quite a few downloads out of each week. The rest of the top 10 states that we get listens from are Florida, Virginia, Oregon, Georgia, Michigan, and New York. So thank you to everyone in those states who listens. I really appreciate you and appreciate you sharing it with people you know who might get something out of the podcast. So I just want to say thank you to people in those states and everywhere else in the United States, because we've had listens in every state. So that's really neat, and I think it's awesome. And I thank all of you for listening, and I appreciate you. Besides the United States, the next most listens come from Canada and the UK. And like I mentioned earlier, I have a guest coming up from who lives in England, and his story was super inspirational, and I loved hearing it. So we get lots of listeners from Canada and the United Kingdom, and then Australia. So I'd say those four are kind of the top four. So US, Canada, UK, and Australia. Some kind of interesting ones that, like I would never have predicted, but have been kind of fun to watch are the next 6 are France, Bahamas, Sweden, Switzerland, Romania, and South Africa. So a nice variety of countries from all over the world. So, and some of them not English speaking. So, well, at least primarily English speaking. So, thank you to everybody who lives in those countries, who listens and who shares it with someone that they know. I want to hear from everybody. So anybody from anywhere in the world that wants to reach out and connect, I would love to hear from you. So I just thought that was pretty cool, and wanted to just share that with you guys. Maybe you found that interesting, maybe not, but I love looking at the stats every week and just seeing where people are listening from, and just thought it'd be cool to let you know that I see your listens and appreciate it. So finally, what's coming up on the podcast? Mentioned it a few times now. Ian Redford is the guest next week, and he is from the north of England and has a really wonderful story to tell. He kind of had an evangelical experience, which I found it unique because in Europe, as he explains in his interview, there's not obviously as strong of a religious, I guess, in the United States, we're a lot more fundamentalism has a bigger stronghold, I'd say, and Europe is not as religious, I guess, in general. So it was fun to hear his perspective from growing up in a European country, how that played out for him. So I'm looking forward to that. And then the following guest is Treg Turner. He's affiliated, or I was able to connect with him through Black Nonbelievers, and he's from the Cincinnati area and had a really interesting story. And in Treg's interview, he mentions a few things. He puts some things into words that I'd never really heard someone say in that way, and I really found to be very, very poignant and profound and really meaningful. And I really loved some of the things he had to share. And so to wrap up this podcast episode, a final thought. Something that has been kind of swirling around in my brain for a while, and I'm not quite sure how this will play out or if it's even a good idea or not, but I'm a part of the Facebook group, Life After God, which is Ryan Bell's group and his affiliated with his podcast. And one day, someone on that group just happened to put out a post to everybody and said, hey, I'm going to be jumping onto Google Hangouts. If someone wants to have a beer and hang out and chat for a while, let me know. And I actually didn't get around to doing that. I wanted to, though, and I always thought it was such a cool idea. And as I've mentioned a few times already in this episode, I really enjoyed the connection piece of doing this podcast. So reaching out and finding people to interview, but also hearing from people. I've heard from several of you through email or Twitter, and I really appreciate those messages and have really enjoyed connecting in that way. So I just thought, like, that's a great idea. I've thought, if there's people who want to do that, who want to maybe do like a Google Hangout every once in a while, It can be like not related to religion. We can just like say hi and get to know each other. Or it can be, talking about deconversion or religion or anything really. So it can be as laid back as we want it to be. But I just thought that was a really cool way to maybe get to know people who are all over the country and all over the world. It makes it easy, and it might be kind of fun, and I think it'd be great to connect with some of you out there. So thank you again for listening to this episode, but also to just being a regular listener to the podcast. I really appreciate you, and I've really enjoyed doing the podcast, and I'm looking forward to continuing to do it. So thanks again. I really appreciate you. Hope you have a great week, and we will see you next week with Ian Redford's interview. Have a great week, everybody.
Thanks for listening to Voices of Deconversion. Be sure to join us next time by subscribing to the podcast. If you have a deconversion story you would like to share, email us at steve@vodpodcast.com.